Good afternoon. I hate to, I'm always, one of the roles I always have at these types of events is the person who breaks up all the stimulating conversations that you're having at your tables. And for that, I'm very sorry. However, it's my real pleasure to welcome all of you today to this policy briefing. It's almost a shame to be inside on such a pretty December day here in Chicago. My name is David Figlio. I'm the director of the Institute for Policy Research. Let me just tell you a word or two about the Institute for Policy Research, especially if this is your first policy research briefing. IPR is an organization that is tasked with connecting people across Northwestern University with regard to conducting and discussing and disseminating the highest quality possible research on issues of key social importance. And that could be anything from thinking about inequality of opportunity to education policy, healthcare policy, housing policy, neighborhood policy, etc. We do this in a number of different ways. We stimulate research, and we connect. We connect researchers to one another. We connect students and scholars. And importantly, and one of the reasons we're here today, is we connect the broader community of interested people, members of the media, policymakers, practitioners, etc., business leaders, together with scholarship. And one of the ways in which we do that is through these policy research briefings. If you're not on IPR's mailing list, I encourage you to sign up. You can go to this web address. You don't even need the www anymore. IPR.northwestern.edu will get you there. Or you can send an email to IPR@northwestern.edu to get signed up so that you never miss any of our events, and also so that you can receive a number of our different print and electronic materials. I want to thank a few, before I introduce our speakers today, I'd like to thank a number of people for making this happen. Of course, this couldn't happen without Patricia Reese and our fantastic communications team, for whom I'm very, very grateful. I really appreciate that. We've also had a number of people who've helped to get the word out. Every seat basically is taken, and there are a number of people watching in TV land today. So I'd like to thank Jennifer Kunde, for example, in government relations, Kathy Grimstead and Lindsay Chase Lansdale, the Chicago Collaboration on Women in STEM, Alicia Wartowski in the Women's Center at Northwestern, and others as well for helping to get the word out. I'd like to make a special shout out to a group of ETHS students who are attending as part of the high school's Women in STEM group. I am the parent of 3 current or former ETHS students at Evanston Township High School, for those of you who are Evanstonians. These students are here with ETHS's Science Department Chair, Terry Soa. So welcome to our fellow Evanstonians. Let me introduce real quick our panelists, but before I do that, let me tell you a few ground rules. We'll move kind of fast and furious through the event itself, so there'll be plenty of opportunity for questions and answers. Please wait till everybody's finished before we have questions, and because it's a sizable room, we have our microphones, so make sure that you don't just start asking questions, but rather wait till a mic comes to you. Also, please silence your cell phones. We don't want that to be recorded on TV land, as I mentioned, either. Okay, so we have 3 speakers. We have 3 speakers today. In the middle is my colleague Alice Eagly. She's the James Padilla. Is that how it's pronounced? That's what I figured. Chair of Arts and Sciences in the psychology department and an IPR fellow. To Alice's right is a visitor for us. We're really happy you're here. Christopher Karpowitz, who's an associate professor of political science at Brigham Young. And to Alice's left is our colleague and soon-to-be associate professor of economics and also an IPR fellow, Laurie Beaman. So I'll leave it up to the three of you as to which order you wish to present in today. But thank you all for coming, and we're really happy you're here.
Thank you very much, David, for that introduction. The first thought that often comes to mind for people when they think about women in leadership is a glass ceiling, which is a metaphor and not a very effective one, I think, in our world. And I'd like you to replace it with this metaphor. That's a labyrinth. Now, you can get through a labyrinth. It's just challenging, right? It's not a straight road. It takes thought and preparation, but you can make your way through with persistence. So that's the metaphor that I think should replace the glass ceiling. And in my comments, I'll tell you something about why that's so. Let's first look at some statistics, some American statistics about women in leadership. These are official statistics, like from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We look at managers and professionals. Women are now 52%. Of the people employed as managers and professionals. It looks like gender equality has arrived, right? It has arrived at tipping toward women. Then we look at managers. It's 39%. Managers have a leadership role. It falls. If we look at CEOs over all organizations, big and small, it's 26% women. But women tend to be in the smaller organizations, because as we look at the Fortune 500, we see a different picture. Board members, 19%, corporate officers, 15%, top earners, 8%, CEOs, 4%. Do you notice a trend? That is the trend. Not too many women in high positions, but women participating in management and leadership for sure, much more than in the past. Let's take a look at political leadership in the United States. Our Congress is 19% women. In terms of world statistics, that places us 76th in the world. We're slightly below Kenya and Saudi Arabia, actually. So it's startlingly low in terms of the Congress. 12% of governors, even lower. 25% of state legislators, that is a bit higher. And 18% of mayors of the 100 largest cities. So I think you can see that women are profoundly disempowered politically in terms of these higher level leadership roles in the U.S. So there is a question then for us to address, right? And that's, why aren't there more women? Women are profoundly underrepresented in the United States in high power, truly high power roles. So there are many possible answers. One is that women somehow lack skills, whatever. Women have become the more educated sex, particularly among the young, where women are getting far more university degrees. They're doing better in school, etc. So it doesn't look like women are just unskilled. In a general sense, perhaps more skilled than men. Well, maybe women are skilled, but not at leadership, would be another idea that people might have. There's extensive research on leadership style in psychology and management. And we do see some small differences, but they're not ones that are disabling to women. Women are slightly more participative on the average than men. They're slightly more relational in terms of building relationships to the people they supervise. These are not bad things. In fact, these are the kinds of characteristics that scholars of leadership recommend as progressive and effective in modern organizations. So women aren't unskilled when they actually take leadership roles. So the question then is, well, then what is holding women back? And there are many answers, but we're going to look at one kind of answer, which is about our broader culture and the way we think about men and women that produces a kind of a skepticism about women as leaders. You all know about gender stereotypes because we all carry them to some extent. We think about men as the more assertive, take charge sex. And we call that agentic in psychology. We think about women as the nicer, friendlier sex, communal, caring. Well, then how do we think about leaders? Well, we think about leaders as people who take charge and are self-confident and assertive. You can see a bit of a problem here, right, at this level of the culture. That men and leaders rather match in our general stereotypes, and women and leaders don't match as much. Women are nice, yes, they're really nicer sex, but do they really take charge? Can they do leadership? There is a certain skepticism that people have, which produces prejudice, actually. And we'll talk a bit about that. So the lowered evaluations of women as actual or potential leaders. So one of the ways it comes out is the double standard. So there's a woman who is a candidate for a powerful role. People might think she's very nice, but I don't know if she can handle the authority. Will people respect her? Will she take charge? So women have to kind of really show it, right? Well, with men, it's more assumed that they could do that kind of thing. So there's a bit of a double standard in terms of actually getting into the leadership role in the first place. Now, the other problem that's created is the double bind. This is the problem that women face when they're in the leadership role. You don't get to stop being a woman just because you have a leadership role. Expectations are that you will be nice and kind and caring. But on the other hand, you're in a leadership role, and sometimes you have to be tough, and you do have to take charge. Are these two expectations compatible? Sometimes, yes. Sometimes it's hard to go along with both. And what we particularly see in the research literature is that when women, even in a leadership role, act tough, they really take charge, they tell people what to do, there is a phenomenon of what we call backlash. The women who are tough and take charge, even though they have the leadership role, I don't know, she's the boss from hell, she's too tough. People will have those more negative reactions when men do those kinds of things. They'll tend to just accept it. Okay, she can be nice, she can be the very kind, caring leader, but then she tends to be seen as weak. So this double bind has to be negotiated carefully and intelligently by women to be successful in leadership roles. It's a challenge that men don't have because they don't have the expectation that they will be nice and kind and caring in the role. So it makes it more complicated. So you think, well, okay, how can we fix this? Well, we can't easily fix problems embedded in the culture, but there would be changes that would be helpful. One would be that, well, maybe leadership is not best enacted in a tough, top-down style. Maybe the notion of what's good leadership could change. And then, well, women could become bolder and more ambitious and more leader-like, take that chance, behave in that way, even if there might be some backlash. And what I want to let you know is that both of those things are happening, which is easing the problem. So has the leader stereotype changed over time? And the answer to that is yes, because in our research, our social science research, there are a number of ways to look at the leader stereotype, how masculine versus feminine is. And we have data going back to the early 1970s. And in a meta-analysis that I've done, we've looked at that stereotype over time, and we see, oh, it's getting more androgynous. What people think is good leadership is getting more androgynous because leadership is incorporating more social skills. So we expect leaders now to be socially skilled. They have socially complex jobs to do. So leadership is taking on more expectation of these soft skills, but retaining its emphasis on assertiveness and taking charge. So it's no less masculine in the sense, it's more feminine, however. So expectations have shifted. Then the other question is, well, what about women? Are women actually changing so that they take on more of the characteristics of leadership, which are those of assertiveness, in part, and the answer to that is definitely yes. Again, there are data over time going back sometimes to the 60s where women rate themselves on how communal and agentic they are, as men do too. And there's a clear trend that women now see themselves as more assertive than in the past, more agentic. And the public thinks that too when they get a chance to rate what women are like. The idea that women are more agentic is definitely there in the mind of the public. So women aren't just nice. Women are also assertive to some extent. And women over time place more importance on career success. In some national polls, you ask about how important it is to you to have a good career. Women exceed among the young people men slightly in the importance they place on career. And they are more interested in leadership in the past, but still lag compared to men on the desire to become a leader, particularly in terms of political office. You ask young women, would you consider running for political office at some time in your life? Men are quite a bit more likely to say yes than women. So there's still that lag around leadership. So what would be the results of these changes? So I said, over time, leadership has changed in our notions of what good leadership is. It's become somewhat more androgynous. Women have become somewhat more assertive and leader-like than in the past. And so the prejudice that people have, or the skepticism about, well, whether women could do leadership well, should have changed, should ease somewhat over time. And I'll show you data that show that that's exactly the phenomenon. Things have actually gotten quite a bit better in terms of women's, the way people think about leadership creates openings for women that weren't there in the past. So this is a poll question that I'm going to show you the results for. It's a famous Gallup Poll question. If you had a new job and you had your choice between a man or a woman as your boss, which would you choose? You might think about your answer. Well, we have data going back to 1953. So we have a wonderful trend over time. So look at 1953 first. That dark green line is people preferring men, and the bottom, medium green, is people preferring women. And in the middle, there are people there who don't really answer the question. They say, oh, I don't know, or whatever. So look at 1953, which is a year I remember. It was 66% for men and 5% for women. It was considered, I guess, kind of ridiculous to have a woman as your boss by most people back in 1953. And so look at the shift over time. If you look at that dark green line, now it's at 33% saying I would prefer to have a man as my boss, 66 down to 33. If you look at the bottom line, that 5%, it does go up, not as dramatically as men's preference goes down, the preference of men. But it's at 20% now. And then the winning preference now is actually the politically correct one. That's not answering the question, saying, oh, it doesn't matter, does it? Or just give me a good boss. Most people are there. Now, there's a lot of political correctness pressure, in this question from the pollsters. But that was always the case. It's a very bold question. But there's a tremendous change over time. So that, yes, people still prefer men over women, right? We see that in the very recent data, the 2014 data. But it's a small preference. And most people are kind of open-minded, thinking, well, it just depends. Men aren't necessarily better. So we have a huge attitudinal shift that reflects the phenomenon I've talked about, women becoming more leader-like, actually, and leadership shifting also to value the social skills that women stereotypically have and actually have. So this is the result, then, that leadership in women, in terms of how the culture construes them at the stereotype level, they are coming together. They haven't gotten there, right? There's still this preference for men, but it's a small preference only. And so that's why the labyrinth is the right image, right? That's a woman who's thinking. She's thinking about her leadership role, and she realizes it's somewhat more complex Yes, she might get backlash if she comes on too strong, but she might come on strong and smile at the same time, right? Build relationships in various ways. So she has something to think about. But the fact is she's there, right? She's reached that goal of the leadership role. And so more and more women are reaching that goal. And we can see these changes in public opinion and in actual behavior of women and men that have made that possible. So those are my comments. Thank you very much.
It's an honor to be here with you today. I'm so pleased to be here on such a beautiful day and to be on this panel with Lori and Alice. I'm learning a great deal from both of them. I want to talk today about gender and groups. That is, settings in which men and women come together to talk and to make collective decisions. These kinds of settings are all around us. You can think of juries or judicial panels from the local level all the way up to the Supreme Court, town council and school board meetings, legislative committees, PTOs, church groups, and in the business world, work groups and teams and corporate boards. Alice has already reviewed some of the statistics about women's presence in some of these different contexts, and as she said, women are still vastly outnumbered in many of these contexts. Women are 50% of the population, but 20%, 25%, at most 30% of most of these contexts. The one place that seems to be a little different is school boards, where women on average are about 40% of the board. This issue of women's representation in decision-making groups was illustrated nicely in the New York Times in January of 2013 when they ran this picture on the front page. This was Obama's inner circle, and the headline was, "It has an all-male look." This became very controversial, and quickly the White House put out a second picture and said, no, this is actually what the inner circle looks like, more around 40% women. And so our question is, what difference does that make? What difference does it make if women are 10% or 20% or 40 or 60 or 80%? And particularly, what happens, since most women are in groups where they are vastly outnumbered, what is the experience for men and women like in those groups? Madeleine Albright, our first female Secretary of State, had lots of experience being in decision-making groups with lots of men, and she said that in her memoir, early in my career, I went to numerous meetings where I was the only woman present. I would want to contribute to the conversation, but would think, if I say that, everybody will think it's really stupid. And then a man would say exactly what I had in mind, and the other participants would find it brilliant. And so our question is about participation and influence and authority in groups. Those of you who are a little older might remember the old E.F. Hutton commercials that said, the tagline was, when E.F. Hutton talks, people listen. And there'd be a group, and suddenly E.F. Hutton would open his mouth, and everybody would listen. And so in that sense, E.F. Hutton had authority, right? And there were two things that were required for his authority. One, he had to say something, and two, other people had to listen and respond to what he was saying. And so in the work that I've done with my co-author, Tali Vendelberg, we talk about authority as the expectation of influence. When you get to a decision-making group, do you expect to have influence? Can you have influence? Authority involves participants' perceptions of themselves and also of each other. It also involves how those participants in the group interact with each other, as I'll try to show. Now, in our work, we've been focused on two features of groups. The first I've already been talking about. Who's in the room? What is the gender composition of the group? But in a group that makes decisions together, there's another feature that might be important, which is how that group makes decisions. What are the norms and rules, both formal and informal, for decision making? And so we're interested in how those two things interact, how who's in the room and the norms and rules of decision-making interact to shape authority in the group. So just to give you a preview of what I'm going to try to show you in a little more detail, we show that having more women in decision-making groups is often very good for women. That's not necessarily surprising, but it's also not the only thing that matters. The rules and norms of decision-making matter too. So let me give you an example of that. In a group that's asked to decide by unanimity, every voice matters and every vote counts. The group cannot make a decision unless everyone agrees. And so that pressure to reach consensus can change the dynamic of the group. It can create norms of inclusion that benefit those who are in the minority in the group, prompting them to participate more and influence other members of the group. So unanimous rule can mitigate women's minority status in the group. Majority rule is good for majorities, right? So majority rule elevates women's talk and their influence when women are in the majority, but leaves them in a more difficult situation when they are in the minority. So we studied this experimentally. We studied it in a variety of ways, but one of the ways I want to tell you about is our experiment. It's called the deliberative justice experiment. And we brought people together in groups of 5. We randomly assigned people to groups of different gender compositions, and we randomly assigned groups to different decision rules, either majority or unanimity. And we told the participants, this was a lab experiment, we told them that later in the experiment they were going to do some work to earn money. We weren't going to tell them what the work was, just that some people would be really good at it and some people would be not so good at it, and so there would be a disparity in how much they actually earned. And then we asked the groups to get together and talk, and to make a decision as a group about how they wanted to distribute or redistribute the income earned during the experiment. They could choose not to redistribute at all and everybody just kept what they earned individually, or they could choose one of several different ways of redistributing the money to make sure that the outcome of the group was a little more equal. There was a lot of money at stake in these particular groups. They could earn as much as $70 or $80 or as little as $10 for being there. So these discussions mattered. And so these groups talked. We did this at 2 different locations, one a liberal and secular place, the other a conservative and religious place. That location didn't seem to matter much for the things that we're going to talk about today. And we had lots of groups and lots of people participating in this experiment. I want to talk about 2 of the main results, focus on 2. One is speaking time and the other is influence, both self-rated influence and other-rated influence. But we looked at many different attributes of the groups and many different parts of the group dynamic. So one of the questions we had was whether or not women spoke equally with men. Now, by equality, what we mean is, did women speak as much as their proportion of the group? So in a group where there are many more women or many more men than women, it wouldn't be surprising if overall in the group men's voices were more often heard than women's. But our question was a little more narrow. That was, do women speak as much as their presence in the group? So if they're 20% of the group, do they speak 20% of, do they take up 20% of the conversation? If they're 40% of the group, do they take up 40% of the conversation? And we call this the equality ratio, the ratio of talk time to their presence in the group. And an equality ratio of 1 would mean that they talk as much as their presence in the group. But what we find is that in majority rule groups, that's the solid line that you see there, when women are outnumbered by men, they not only talk less than men, but they talk much less than their presence in the group. So for example, a group where women make up only 20% of the group, women take up about 10 to 12% of the group's conversation, far less than their actual presence in the group. So their voices are simply heard a lot less. And in majority rule groups, having more women helps a lot. In groups with more women, with a greater percentage of women, more women come much closer to this standard of equality. When women are 80% of the group, they hit that standard, in fact, exceed it just a little bit. So that's the trend under majority rule. But under unanimity, things look quite different. Under unanimity, women who are outnumbered by men come much closer to equality of participation. They don't actually reach it, they don't get quite there, but they come much closer. And under unanimity, having more women in the group doesn't seem to change that trend very much at all. For men, the results look like this. Men are always, almost always, above that line of equality. They always speak more than their presence in the group. And you can see the dashed line for unanimity. The minority men, so men in groups where they're surrounded by women, boy, they really talk a lot. They become much, much more active in the group. So that was a lab experiment. We also looked at school boards. I mentioned before, school boards are a good place to look because we get lots of variation. There are school boards with many, many women on the board. So there are some with no women and some with lots of women. And these are all majority rule groups. And in those school boards, we find the exact same dynamic that we found in the lab. When women on school boards are outnumbered by men, they not only speak less than men, but they speak far less in their presence in the group. Now, why does that matter? Maybe it doesn't matter at all. Maybe talk time in a group is just chattiness, and some people are chattier or more loquacious than others. But we find that it does matter. It does matter quite a bit. You may have been in a group sometime where you felt like, the person who was quiet and only said one thing kind of moved the whole group and was the most influential person in the group. And you might have experienced that, but what we find is that that's the exception, not the rule, right? In order to be seen as influential, you have to talk. In our lab experiment, we asked everybody after their group discussion was over, we asked them privately, who was the most influential person in the group? And it turns out that the people who spoke more were almost always much more likely to be voted as the most influential person by the other members of the group. Not only are they seen as more influential by other people, but they're also seen as more influential by themselves. They think of themselves as being a more influential person in the group. And that relationship between talk time and self-rated influence is especially important for women. The more women talk, the more they're likely to say that they were influential in the group experience. So, what have we found? We found that the features of the group, who's present, and the rules for making decisions affect participation, how much or how little each person talks, and that in turn has a profound effect on influence in one's own eyes or in the eyes of others. Now, I won't go through the details here, but we also found that in groups where women were empowered by decision rule and or gender composition, women not only spoke more, but they also spoke differently. They raised their distinctive preferences and priorities more. One example, they were much more likely to talk about children or to talk about care for the poor in places where women were more empowered. They also interacted differently with the other members of the group. So women when women were empowered by the decision rule and the gender composition, they experienced fewer negative interruptions from men and much more positive reinforcement from men. Thus, they had greater respect and greater rapport in the group. That too is a measure of authority. Finally, women were better able to move the group decision in favor of greater generosity toward the poor in places where they were more empowered. So what we've tried to argue is that what happens in meetings matters for men and women and for their authority and influence. Group discussion is not just a place to exchange reasons. It's also a place where authority is constructed, and it's constructed in the process of interacting with one another. Authority, then, is affected by these larger group features. So if we care about authority, and we care about women's influence in the boardroom, or on the school board, or in the jury room, we ought to care both about who's in the room and the norms and rules for decision making. Thanks.
Thank you for bearing with me. My focus today is talking about women's political empowerment, and this issue is really quite salient at the moment. We have Hillary Clinton, who is the front runner for the Democratic nomination, and on the left we have Justin Trudeau, who is the recently elected Prime Minister of Canada. He selected exactly half of his cabinet positions to be filled by women. And when asked why he did that, his answer was very simple: because it's 2015. I'm going to refrain from making a reference of women-filled binders. Alice already did a great job of giving us what the statistics look like within the US. I would say if we look globally, the picture is pretty similar in terms of women's representation in political institutions. So women constitute around 22% of parliamentarians worldwide. That number varies a little bit from year to year. We do see in some regions of the world that number has increased dramatically over the last couple of decades. And we think one reason why that's happened is the introduction of political quotas. Sweden has been a leader, not surprisingly, in introducing quotas for women. The Liberal Party in Sweden introduced voluntary quotas on the number of candidates who are women as early as 1972. Argentina started a movement within Latin America for legal candidate quotas in the early 1990s. So I'm talking about what are the barriers to women's participation in political institutions, and what have quotas done in order to affect public policy as well as women's empowerment. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about research that I've been involved with, looking at India's experience with quotas. Before I do that, I want to just give you a sense of globally which countries have political quotas and what type of variation is there in quotas. So the blue and the yellow dots indicate countries that have a quota system for the number of candidates. So this system usually is very easy to implement in a proportional representation system. So where a political party will have a list of candidates, and they can require that 30 or 50%, for example, of the candidates on that list be women. The difference between the blue and the yellow is whether or not those are voluntary or whether or not they're legally required by electoral law, for example. The red dots indicate a more robust form of political quotas, which is reserved seats. So reserved seats, that would work in a political system like we have in the US, where a particular constituency would have to have a woman representative, only women could run, and ultimately only women could be elected. This is the type of quota system that they have at the local level in India, which I'll be telling you a lot more about. It also is a system that they have in Rwanda, and I highlight Rwanda because they've had a remarkable increase in the number of female leaders, and in fact have more than 50% in one of their houses. More than 50% are in fact women. So I'm not throwing them under the bus. So what do we know about whether quotas work? And what do I mean by quotas work? So the very minimum sense is, does it actually get more women into those seats, into those positions of power? If you compare countries that have quotas and countries that don't, you certainly see more women in positions of power in places that have quotas. However, it's not quite as obvious. You might be like, that's not very surprising. The subtlety there is that the types of quotas which are just on the number of candidates, it doesn't necessarily lead to an increase in the number of women who are actually elected. So political parties can do savvy things like put women low on the list, and so that very few of those women actually get elected in Or if they'll put a lot of women on lists in places where that party is very weak, and so they're not going to win very many seats. And even though overall nationally they have lots of women candidates, very few of those candidates actually get elected into office. The second thing I want to point out is that comparing countries with and without quotas might not be all that meaningful because the places where there were those dots for those quotas was not really randomly assigned, right? So the fact that Sweden introduced these quotas is perhaps not surprising. Sweden already had a high level of women in politics before they implemented the quota, for example. Okay, what are the advantages and disadvantages of having quotas? So I'll start on the positive. What are the advantages? Women are 50% of the population. As Chris already just highlighted, sometimes women have different policy preferences than men. And so if we want to have those preferences represented in our government, we might need to have women, in fact, in those positions of power. It turns out that male politicians, even though they're representing a lot of women in their constituencies, might not actually implement policies in line with women's preferences. So there's some really interesting work by Yvonne in Washington, the university, at Yale University, showing that congressmen who have daughters instead of sons, so that's a random event, whether you get a boy or a girl baby, the congressmen who have daughters are much more likely to vote in favor of reproductive rights than those congressmen who only have sons. A second advantage is the potential for there to be a role model effect. So women who are put into leadership positions because of quotas might improve the pipeline of women leaders, both in politics as well as in business. What are the disadvantages? The first one I highlight is probably not very relevant for rich countries such as the US or in Europe, but it's something that we did see in India, which was especially in the short run in places where women are much less likely to go to university, say, than boys. You might find that you get less qualified candidates. I will say qualified in the sense of what their qualifications are on paper. In the Indian case, we found women, even if they were less likely to have gone to school, they still managed to perform really well in office. A second potential disadvantage is the backlash that Alice has already highlighted. Voters might really not like having to elect a woman, and that may actually undermine the potential upsides of a quota. And second, it might also limit the influence of women once they actually are in power. In Europe, there's kind of discussion of like, oh, well, she's a quota woman, so she doesn't have very much influence in parliament. There's also some disadvantages specifically about reserve seats, and that is if one seat has to be reserved for a woman, that's going to restrict the choice of voters in that particular area, which is a definite disadvantage. And if you rotate which constituencies have reserved seats over time, that also creates more political turnover, and that might reduce accountability of politicians. I'm focusing on political quotas, but just so you're aware, there's also other types of quotas, including quotas on the percentage of women on corporate boards. Norway has had this kind of a quota since 2006. The research on what is the impact has been a little bit disappointing given the goals of these types of quota. There's some evidence that firms that have lots of women on their board seem to have less valuation in the stock market. There's some evidence of some nuance of female leadership style. So in downtimes, these firms laid off fewer workers. It'll be interesting to know in the long term if that's a good or bad strategy in terms of profits. And finally, there's also limited evidence that, in fact, this has improved the pipeline of women getting into kind of upper management positions. Although, this policy has not been in place for very long, and so continued research is needed to see what's going to happen in the longer run. So let me dig into a little bit more the Indian case and what we can learn from India's experience with quotas. The way quotas came about was part of a constitutional amendment requiring that 1/3 of local village council presidents be women. So this is an enormous policy in the world's largest democracy. It's also nice for us to be able to really understand what is the causal impact if you implement quotas, what then happens, because essentially nobody wanted to have a woman leader, and so they randomized who had to have a woman in a given election. So what do we find? So some of the immediate impacts. First of all, do reservation quotas lead to more women being elected? Yes. So we find it goes from about 5% in a place that doesn't have a quota going up to 100%. So the quotas were well implemented in this case. Second, Does it lead to more women participating in the political process? I have sort of here. We observe that women villagers are more likely to speak at political meetings when there's a female president. So that's consistent with Chris's findings from the US. But also consistent with Alice's story about the labyrinth, we find that those female presidents are actually less likely to be chairing the meeting. So it seems like they're influencing their power in perhaps a slightly different way than their male counterparts. And third, we also find that having female leaders leads to different types of policies being implemented, and in particular policies which are more aligned with women's preferences at the local level. So I want to highlight 3 more findings that we got from studying India's experience with quotas. And they suggest the potential for the longer run. It suggested what would happen if we had a quota for some time and then pulled it back. The first is on aspirations. So we interviewed girls, teenage girls, in places that had a female leader versus places that did not have a female leader because of the quota. And we found in places that had a female leader for at least 10 years, those teenage girls expressed aspirations about their education, about their career, and about marriage, mostly about the age at which they get married, that was much more similar to boys than those places that never had a female leader. Reassuringly, we also saw that the parents, their aspirations for their daughters versus their sons, when they had exposure to a female leader in the past. The second encouraging result is that we found that voters of adult villagers in places that have been exposed to a female leader seem to exhibit a lot less prejudice towards female leaders. And finally, we also, kind of consistent with this, we found that once a seat became competitive again, once men could then run for office in that given locality, women were then more likely to be willing to be candidates and then ultimately win seats when they became competitive again. So let me just those last 2 results. Let me give you just a couple of figures. This figure shows data from a survey that we did in over 500 villages in India, in West Bengal in particular. It was a survey experiment, so we wrote down a political speech, and then we had a man deliver the speech and a woman deliver the speech. The content of the speech was exactly the same. And then we asked villagers who either heard randomly the male versus the female version, on a scale of 1 to 10, how effective do you think this pronoun is? The pronoun, sorry, is the president. On the left, that's the results in places that had never had a female leader. Those are the never reserved places. And we see strong evidence of prejudice against female leaders. Remember, the content of the speech is the same, and yet villagers were much less likely to say that the female version was effective compared to the male politician. However, in places that had been reserved for a woman in the past, that prejudice vanishes, and these hypothetical male and female leaders are evaluated to be the same. This figure shows what happens in an election. So the figure is showing you the percentage of women. In blue, it's the percentage of women who were candidates. And in light purple, that's the percentage of winners who were women. And so the first 4 bars suggest that in places that had had no women or a female politician only for a short time, only about 5% of candidates and only about 5% of winners were women. However, that rate about doubles in places that had previously had a woman leader for about 10 years. So that's a significant increase, but of course it's only getting us up to about 10 or 12%. So we're far from then kind of achieving parity. So what are my takeaways? Women leaders can pave the way for long-term changes. We saw that more women willing to run for office after a seat had been reserved means that they could have sustainable changes in policymaking. The second is that voters view women leaders more positively once they've been exposed to a female leader. And thirdly, by influencing aspiration, these women leaders might be able to have a big influence beyond just their direct policies that they're implementing by serving as role models for future generations of girls. So to conclude, our research is suggesting that the barriers to getting women elected, a lot of it seems to come from persistent negative attitudes towards female leaders, but exposure to a female leader can help alleviate that problem. And there's also potential failure by political parties and systems to promote women candidates. So quotas might be a temporary measure in order to overcome these barriers. I will say I do think there's a lot that we can learn from India's experience, even in the US, even though these are very different places and different cultures. I will say that politically it's going to be quite a challenge to implement. In the US, especially given the US political system, but maybe during the Q&A, Chris actually has some interesting ongoing work of how to more gently nudge politicians and parties in the direction instead of implementing quotas. Thank you.
So thank you to Laurie, Alice, and Chris for really stimulating presentations. I'd like to say before we open this up for questions, IPR's tagline is interdisciplinary, nonpartisan, and policy relevant, and all three of those really, I think, come through extremely strongly in this, the presentations we've seen today. We have before you a psychologist, a political scientist, and an economist. And one thing that I think is really pretty special about what we try to do at IPR is bring together different disciplinary lenses and perspectives on very similar types of questions. And I think the proof is in the pudding in terms of the types of really outstanding engagement we can really get in those types of cases. And obviously it's extremely policy relevant, both in terms of potentially the natures of policies that get enacted, as well as broadly speaking, if we're interested in representation, what are some different ways to get there? So again, I really appreciate that. As a dad of 3 daughters as well, I'm particularly interested in this specific research question. So why don't we open it up to, if you raise your hand, and we can wait for a mic to come to you. And it would be great if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and saying who you are as you speak as well.
Hi, that was loud. I work over at Feinberg, I'm in the development office. I loved hearing all 3 of the presentations. And so my question is for Chris. As you talk about the representation of women in meetings, not speaking up, do you have statistics or data to support how often women wanted to speak up and did it, instead of just not speaking up altogether? Does that make sense?
Yes, that's a great question. The answer is no, we don't have that. What we can do is compare these different contexts, right? So we can see how the features of the group change the extent to which women actually do speak up. I'm doing a study right now where we're trying to follow work groups. They're actually student groups at a business school, because these groups meet a lot over a long period of time. And right now we're doing the pilot study where we're asking them lots of questions about how they feel about their groups. And this is a great question. So I wish I could give you specific data on that, but we do know just from the differences in the groups that this is not a matter of women having nothing to say, right? When they're under-participating, it's not the case that they don't have something to contribute. Somehow the norm and the dynamic of the group is making it difficult for them to articulate in at least the same way they do in other contexts.
Hi, my name is Carmen. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Education in Health Sciences. And my question is for the 3 of you. I don't know who has the answer, but you know, we talk here really about the binary, male, female, but we know that society is so much more complex than that. You know, if we take into consideration socioeconomic status, ethnicity, race, what happens to all the trends that you talked about, or maybe in the case of India, where there are castes, then what happens?
Well, in terms of the kind of stereotyping I was talking about, we do know that it varies by racial group. And that makes a difference, at least in some experimental demonstrations. African American women have a stereotype compared to the other groups, whites, Latinos, etc., of being more strong and tough. And that does, at least in some studies, show that they get less backlash for taking charge than white women, Latino women, Asian women do. But there was the sad part about it when they were portrayed as having made a major mistake, that they failed temporarily in their jobs. That's when they got more backlash than the other groups. So it's as if the stereotype was whipped back. Oh, we knew they couldn't do it, So so it's actually a rather complex picture, but yes, certainly race, ethnicity and race do matter in the way people think about women and men and about leadership.
I wanted to ask you this. So in terms of quotas, it's a really important question. And in the Indian context, there's a lot of concern that, oh, my mic isn't on? And all sorts of technological problems. It is very much a concern when thinking about quotas. And in the Indian case, there was concerns that by having more women, you might have a reduction in, say, lower castes or Muslims in particular. And you might see a reduction in the representation of that group's interests by increasing the number of women. Empirically, it seems that, in fact, by having more women, you actually got more lower caste women, simply because the restrictions on women's mobility is actually much stronger for higher caste women. And empirically, we didn't see a reduction in the number of Muslims who were elected into office. But certainly, I think, that was the outcome, but there was the potential of there being that trade-off. And India, for example, has both scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, reservations. And so you have some areas which you have to have a woman specifically from these different ethnic minorities as well. So they were somewhat conscious of that when they're trying to design the overall system.
I don't have a whole lot to add other than to say, yeah, I think you're exactly right that these overlapping intersectionality, these overlapping identities and the issue of intersectionality is really important. In our experimental study, we were only looking at white men and women, and that's not because we don't think these other things are important. In fact, we think they're incredibly important, and we didn't know. We thought they would change the dynamic enough that we had to understand one group to begin with. But I think that's absolutely. I think you've asked a really important question, and I think we need more data in terms of the group settings that I've been talking about.
Sherry Diamond, law school and IPR and psych, so a little bit of everything. And all of these were wonderful presentations, just great. Chris and Lori, there's an interchange between you that's going on in Argentina right now on juries. And that is that the 1853 Constitution of Argentina guaranteed the right to jury trial, but they are just getting around to it. And province by province. But what is true across the provinces is that the jury must be composed of 6 men and 6 women, every jury. So we're going to be very interested to see what happens in terms of foreperson selection, because the general pattern of all of the research in this country has been that men are much more likely to be forepersons rather than women. So then my question for Alice is, I just looked it up to check it, I thought I remembered it. 36% of chief justices of state supreme courts are women. It's not 50%, but 36% is pretty high. And compared to the numbers that you put on the board of the various positions, I thought it might be interesting to hear you talk about that kind of increased representation in those leadership roles in that setting.
Yes, I think it is. In the judiciary, we do have somewhat better representation, also at the Supreme Court now, with 3 women. So how does that happen? Well, it's not directly the people, right? In terms of public opinion. Well, so women have entered law in large numbers, and so have been successful in their career in various ways. So I guess it's a different route to leadership. But it's important that they're there, because they are role models. We see them a lot, and so that would have the positive influence that I think that Lori talked about.
Dimitra Turtonopoulos with Info.
So the question I have for you that we have seen in a lot of the organizations that I'm involved is that there's a lot of subconscious bias and perceptions, but not from an audience like this, that's majority women, but from the men. But if you ask them, they'll tell you there's no problem. What, I mean, I see women in boards all the time. There was one just now that got the coffee. So how is it that we can change that aspect of it, like that there is a problem, and then can educate people and tell them that there's also advantages when you do have more women involved?
Well, because as a psychologist, I should answer that. Oh, I think it is difficult. We do know that attitudinally, ideologically, women are the more progressive sex on gender and other issues. And so that is there in people's attitudes. And we also know that people have unconscious bias in the sense they have associations, they gain associations that they're not aware of particularly, but that affect their behavior. So how do you counter that? Well, there is a lot of research on trying to get people to unlearn unconscious bias, but it doesn't necessarily work, actually, over time, because once they get out of the treatment, they may get multiple perceptions of a lot of women in leadership or something in an experiment, and it will only last a little while because then life takes over. So as far as that kind of stereotyping goes, the only long-term solution is that people's observations are different, because that's what's producing the unconscious bias. So they need exposure to a lot of women as leaders, for instance. Just telling them, you could try to make people more conscious and use top-down monitoring of bias, but they can't monitor all the time because the brain is filled with many other tasks that people do. So it's truly a difficult problem. But basically, what Lori talked about and what we see is, experiences with women in leadership doing well, being confident, and we just have to keep at it, and we have to have courage to speak up, in particular, as Chris said.
Yeah, if I can just chime in there, I think Alice is exactly right. These sorts of stereotypes are most likely to change, and she's the person who's done the best research on this through experience. I think what we would have to add is just a small aspect of that, and that is, in group settings, what happens in the group matters. And so that means attending to the features of the group. As I said, authority is not only something that you bring to a meeting, but it also happens in the meeting. And so if we attend to the features of the group, how many women, how few women, what's the match between the gender composition and the norms for making decisions in the group, then we can, those are things over which we have control, right? We may not be able to immediately change the gender composition. As Lori said, that's hard in the American context because there are some groups that are philosophically opposed to things like quotas. So it's a really hard question. But say you're in a group that has few women. Well, that means you need to pay extra special attention to how the group is deciding, because these other features, like the group's decision rule, like the norms of how the group interacts with one another, they can either construct authority or dampen women's authority. And I don't think any one experience is going to change the world, but repeated experiences in the way that Alice is describing, I think, are really important. And that means, for those of us who care about these issues, really attending to things like who's in the room and how do we interact with each other, what's the dynamic, what's the decision rule.
From my Shirley Office for Research, thank you very much. It was really enlightening. And so you have showed us results or numbers over the years, and it seems like nature is taking its course and is favoring women slowly but surely. But now with the women as characterized by the economists becoming the strongest sex, is there an opportunity, a window of opportunity to really change the trajectory towards women leadership? I want to hear your thoughts, but whether we see it happening quicker maybe. And what would be your suggestions or thoughts about taking advantage of where we are in time and training, mentoring, educating women early on, like we see here high school students, which is great, but can we even start earlier? Can we start at earlier age? Can we really instill in these girls from a very early age some of the skills or qualities or confidence that will help us change the trajectory?
Well, I think we can. I think those programs are very valuable so that girls can think about leadership. It helps that in the culture we see leaders out there, you can point to them. But young girls have many other things on their minds, but we want to put leadership in there for sure. And so there are programs. We have some work going at Northwestern to interest Northwestern women students in leadership. So it's not always that they flock to these programs, though, just because they do have many other things in their mind. But we need to keep at it. I think that it certainly can make a difference. I think it will make a difference. We might get this upward shift in the trajectory if we have a woman president. I think we see it's such an important role, and we would see her many times. If that happens, I think it would make a big difference. We don't know, do we? But maybe.
If I could just add it, use my microphone. Actually, the gender wage gap, we saw pretty dramatic reductions over time, and in the last decade or so, that convergence has actually been stagnating, despite the fact that we see women's educational attainment overcoming men. So I think these next 10 years are going to be really interesting to see what happens in the labor market with that gender wage gap. And just one other thing I'll say, since I have a daughter, but I also just had a son, and I think we also have to think that training the boys and what their behavior is in these meetings is also something we shouldn't forget. And I think women role models are important also for not just the girls but for the boys as well.
I figure I'll jump in on this just because this is an area in which I've done a bit of research myself, and so there are a few different dimensions that I think are really interesting. One thing, to reinforce something that Laurie was just saying, is that actually, one thing that we've seen is that academically, women have been mopping the floor with men, so to speak. That's a technical term, for quite some time. If you look back, as far back as we've been keeping track, into the 40s, for example, women have been, girls in school have been outperforming boys. But what happened is, of course, there was less of a willingness for families to be investing in their daughters to continue on, and so you would see higher rates of high school dropout or non-completion amongst women than men. Then, of course, one of the things we've started to see over the last several decades is that in every other academic dimension now, what we've been seeing in terms of test scores and other types of academic performance are now manifested everywhere else. So in terms of high school graduation rates women have ever taken men, in terms of college attendance, especially selective college attendance, completion at all levels of college, graduate school enrollment, and then what happens, right? We get into this place where then we get into the labor market, and we start to see that there's a big, there's still a pretty substantial male advantage. I think one thing that's extremely important for all of us as social scientists to be thinking about and especially people who are interested in policy, is what are specific policies that seem to be causing, when it looks like in terms of every measurable dimension of human capital, women seem to be outperforming men on average, and then we get into this particular place. And I have a few ideas for that, but these that range from anything from family leave policies that tend to be very biased against female advancement, as well as a lot of different cultural types of factors as well. And so I'll mention very briefly one cultural thing that I've spent a fair amount of time studying, which is this feedback loop that comes to women, that happens to women when they're very young girls. So about 15 years ago, I did a lot of research on the causal consequences of first names. I've helped some of you in this room name your children as a consequence of that. And it wasn't that I actually really cared about names per se, but names, of course, have some cultural currency. And one of the things that I studied was what were the likelihood that the linguistic femininity of a name might lead to reinforcement of gendered behaviors, for example, among girls. And that happened in terms of, say, shying away. We have ETHS's women's STEM group. So one of the things that I found was the more linguistically feminine a girl's name was, the less likely she was for any given level of mathematical aptitude to pursue advanced math and science classes. And there are several other things kind of related to that as well. That's not because of the name. There's nothing about a name that's doing that, but it's about something about the feedback that seems to be, that, by the way, was within families. So it's not that families who tend to like linguistically feminine names for their daughters tend to do this. I was comparing sisters, one with a relatively linguistically feminine name, one with a relatively linguistically androgynous name, and we were seeing that. So the point about all of that is just to say that I think that anything that we can do to help to put a thumb on culture and put a thumb on policy is going to be particularly helpful, I think, in terms of finally breaking through that barrier. So sorry to kind of assert myself into the conversation here, but I guess
that was great. Could I add?
Go for it.
So Princeton did an interesting study a few years ago where they looked at men and women who were accepted in terms of their desire to be leaders. And what they found was that prior to setting foot on campus, women and men were indistinguishable in their desire to be leaders. But about a month after being on campus, a dramatic gender gap had occurred. So I don't know quite exactly what that feedback is that the women at Princeton were getting, but I think we need to understand that a lot better. And if I could just add a little bit of politics as the political scientist on the panel, we also see pretty dramatic differences between the parties in terms of women who are candidates, right? So, and running for office and successfully running for office. That trend line has been up for Democrats. It's been basically flat since about 1985 for Republicans. And so that says there's something going on in that party, and we want to understand better what's happening. We've been doing a little bit of work with Republicans in Utah to try to see would messages from party leaders who are totally opposed to quotas, right? I mean, just intensely opposed to quotas, could a message that said, we want more women to run and win, could that make a difference? And in fact, we found that at least in terms of party races, like for elections to be delegates to the state party convention, those kinds of messages matter. So again, the kind of messages we send, the culture we have, those can make a big difference for women's willingness and ability to take on leadership roles.
I'm going to hand up over here for a long time.
Hello, I'm Joki Kamau, Women's Center, originally from Kenya. It was interesting to hear where Kenya is in terms of borders. They're very encouraging. But anyway, when I go to Kenya, I get asked these questions as I'm about to do in December for the holidays. The question is always, why is it that other countries that we term as part of the third world are able to elect women presidents? And the United States, that is the model of democracy, supposedly has been unable to elect a female president. So having said that, in thinking about Hillary Clinton, you can tell where I am politically. I know that IPR is not partisan, so thinking about Hillary Clinton, what challenges is she likely, do you think, to face in terms of attitudes and stereotypes? And I'm not saying that you be her campaign advisor, but if you are advising her, how does she, circumvent these in order to win? And do you think that we are in a place truly where we can elect a female president in the United States in 2016?
Well, about the stereotyping issue, I think she does have good advisors, and I'm sure she's aware of, the research literature where the backlash phenomenon is alive and well, and showing that if women take charge, they hold the floor, they speak in a loud voice, etc., that they often get a dislike as a reaction. And so she is vulnerable to that, but I think she also conveys warmth, which is one of the solutions. So if a woman is strong, if she can also convey warmth and caring qualities at the same time, that would be good. And I think she does that a lot. When she's up there on the stage, she's smiling a lot. And I remember when she was a candidate in the prior round, her daughter would be there, and before and after the speech, she'd be rushing up and hugging people. She was conveying a whole lot of warmth. Maybe a lot of people didn't notice it, but she really was. So I think she is very aware. As far as her winning, it depends on the opposition, of course. But hey, I think there's a good chance with that comparison. But IPR is not political, and so I didn't mean that as a political statement.
We'll strike that from the record.
Maybe I would say two additional words. But sometimes she is accused of being inauthentic, and I have wondered if that fits into some of the stereotype challenges that Alice has been talking about. If people simply hold her to a different standard on that front, because maybe I'm a cynical political scientist, but it seems to me all politicians are inauthentic in one way or another. In terms of her winning, I think it depends on the opposition. We did a poll in Utah, very red Utah, that showed that if Donald Trump were the opposition, even Utah would be competitive. I doubt, I'm still skeptical that he will be the nominee, and I think in a larger sense there are other, I have to say this to keep my political scientist card, that there are other bigger structural issues that are going to go on that are going to shape the race, like the state of the economy, what is the state of the world in terms of terrorism and other things like that. And those bigger forces will also shape the race.
So with IPR, we start on time and end on time, and by my watch, we have 2 minutes. So if somebody has a very quick question that's quick to answer, you can have the last question.
Sorry, I love having minutes to the last one. I think there's so much, or I've seen so much variability in women leadership across different fields, and I'm wondering if the three of you have any maybe explanation for that. I know, my name is Mary Quasi. I'm in preventive medicine in Pembroke School of Medicine. I happen to be a biostatistician, and I know the statistics field has come far and away. We've had many, many women leaders for the American Statistical Association as far back as I can say, like 1938, I think, something like that. But I'm just wondering why you think there's such variety in how far women have progressed through certain fields.
Well, I have to say that women, are more common as leaders where there are a lot of women in the field, in the profession, in the job. When we get to be a majority, the women are more likely to rise. So I think it has to do with the ratios a lot, which also relates to the stereotyping, actually, because women tend to be attracted to occupations that do have more communal content or represent communal values to them, where they're people-oriented and help people in a very direct way. And so women tend to be in those occupations. Healthcare has attracted a lot of women as that field has grown. And so where there are a lot of women, then I think more women rise. But it's not, men still may do a bit better, but women do relatively better in those fields.
I think it's useful perhaps to close on an anecdote of something that's happened in my own profession. I'm an economist. Over the over the last couple of months, there have been a number of very prominent newspaper articles written about people who happen to be husband and wife teams. One was Angus Deaton and Ann Case. Angus Deaton just won the Nobel Prize in Economics. Arguably, his spouse Ann Case is just as prominent and renowned in my profession, but yet a tremendous amount of news media coverage basically about their joint work would omit Ann Case altogether, or say Angus Deaton, an esteemed professor at Princeton, and his wife Ann Case did this. She's also an esteemed professor at Princeton. And then of course there's also Larry Katz and Claudia Golden, who are extraordinary labor and education economists at Harvard. I'm really happy to say that a number of us, led by our colleague who's in Washington right now, Diane Shanzabat, led a very strong pushback against this, and we were really happy that some of the work that this joint letter that I co-signed, but Diane really led the charge on, seemed to have had made a pretty substantial difference in terms of some later reporting that happened in the New York Times. I bring this up not only to pat my colleague on the back, but because she really did a remarkable job there, but in part because of some of the interesting conversation that opened up in how economics was being reported. And I think it's really very relevant. Some journalists argued that the reason that this type of thing happened was partially because women were less likely to answer the phone when they called. I don't know whether that's true or not. If it is, then my charge to this largely female audience would be, please answer the phone. I think that's only a tiny fraction of it personally. I think that Claudia Golden didn't have to answer the phone in order for Adam Davidson, for example, to mention her affiliation, for example, and not just her marital status. But this is a point. Economics is still very much a male profession. We're seeing larger and larger numbers of female leaders in economics. Many other professions are like that as well. But I think that this panel makes it clear that in society, in academia, in scholarship, in politics, there's an awful lot of promise, but also a lot of work that we all have to do together. I want to thank our panelists again and thank all of you for coming as well. So let's give them one.